Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Let's go and take a look at how my March reading went. So if you've been watching my wrap-up videos, you'll know that I had a really good January, a really good February. March wasn't quite as good, but I'm only really able to say that in comparison to those previous 2 months. So it was still a good month, but it's quite a bit of a drop down from that stellar start to the year that I had. What I'll do as usual is go through the stats first of all, and I'll leave the timestamps below so you can skip this part if you're not interested in the stats, and then we'll get into the books that I read. So first of all, I finished 7 books in March. I also had 2 that I DNF'd. Both of these actually were ARCs through Netgalley, so I'll go through the details of those when I cover the books, but as usual, for a book that I've DNF'd, I don't include it in my stats, so the page count, the ratings and so forth won't be reflected in this first part of the video. And although I'll put a review up on Goodreads as with every book I read, I also don't give a star rating because I didn't read the entire book. So for the 7 books that I finished, it gives me a total of 3,051 pages read at an average of 438 pages per book. And the average rating I gave is 3.75. Now this is slightly skewed because I did read 3 titles for SPFBO that I've not given a star rating because they're not the sort of book that I would normally pick up, and therefore it would be unfair for me to give them a rating. For the year to date, that moves my total page count to 10,505. The average page count is 553, and the average rating is 4.2. On to the series, and this year I've started 5. I haven't finished any series as yet, but I have decided not to continue with one series, so that's kind of a DNF for series. I've read the first book in the series but decided not to continue with it. Of the series that I am continuing with, there are currently 31 on my list, and I'm up to date with 15 of those. And then the last stat, as usual, is the day since my last 5-star rating, which is currently sitting at 39 because the last 5-star rating I had was back in February for, I believe it was Age You All Sin by Daniel T. Jackson. So for the books, we'll start off with the 2 that I DNF'd. As I say, both of these were ARCs that I received through Netgalley. Because of that and because of the nature of the other books, there's only actually one of the 9 books I'll talk about today that I've actually got a physical copy of. So the first of the ARCs that I didn't finish, which I of course do not have physical copies of, was The Warden by Daniel M. Ford. This is one that I really liked the cover for. I loved the colour combination. I just thought it looked really cool, and the idea, the premise behind the book was also pretty good. We've got a new warden essentially. It's one of these where there's various different words. You might call them wizards or mages or whatever. I think the warden is called a wizard a few times in the story, but we've got this new warden who's also a necromancer. They have different kind of schools. I think there's 7 different schools of magic, and she's got various of those under her belt, but I guess you might call it's like her major, her main area of study, if you like, is necromancy. And it's not about reanimating the dead, it's a bit more subtle than that, which I do appreciate actually. The new warden moves into this kind of backwater town, and she moves into the old warden's residence, which is kind of a wizard's tower. And it's all falling apart a little bit. The front door literally is kind of hanging on its hinges. So she puts up wards to keep it in place and to keep the place secure. And we go through various kind of scenes, I guess, where she's introducing herself to the people. They don't like her because she's a necromancer and they're a bit wary of her. They're maybe a bit wary of magic as a whole, and they don't really want her around. They're all shunning her and things like that, and she's just trying to get on their good side and try to fit in essentially. Now the issue that I had with this, and the reason that I DNF'd it, was well, it was twofold really. One, I didn't really like the humour. I didn't really like the way that the book was written. It was all very kind of pally and jokey, and it didn't quite work for me in that sense. Even though I do like a bit of humour in my books, this one just wasn't the right type of humour for me. And the second part is, I didn't think it really kicked on. So I said that it was an interesting premise. We didn't really get round to it. We didn't start actually focusing on the main story. Every time I thought we were going to do that, we had a little thing and then it was over quickly, and then the warden goes back to her tower and she starts fixing the place up a little bit more. So we didn't really kick on with the main storyline, and in the end, because the writing wasn't really working for me, I decided to give up on waiting for something major to happen. So that was a disappointment, of course, because I want to enjoy every book, but I specifically liked the idea and the look of this one and thought that I might have a good time with it. And then the second Netgalley DNF that I had was for Night Angel Nemesis by Brent Weeks. This one's listed on Goodreads as book 4 in the Night Angel series. In the book itself it says that it's book 1 of the Kyla Chronicle, so I presume there's going to be another book or another couple of books in this particular series. This one does follow on from the Night Angel trilogy, which is one that I quite liked. It was a very interesting story. I read it quite a long time ago, so I can't remember, if I'm honest, too many specifics, but I do remember I quite liked it. I liked some of the characters, Kyla Stern and Durzo Blint and so forth. And this one is set a little bit afterwards, of course, and we've got the story, the kind of who the characters are and what situation they're in, kind of follows on from the end of the Night Angel series. With this one, again, the humour was one of the reasons that I didn't really like it. We follow Kyla Stern as the Night Angel, and he's going out on a job and he's kind of chronicling the story. It's not really apparent at first, it's just told in the first person. But after a couple of chapters, we become aware that he's actually chronicling his story to an entity, if you like, that he kind of carries with him. And the reason I didn't really like this, although it's not a new way of telling the story to chronicle the events that are happening, it didn't really work for me because the entity that is kind of recording this story starts talking back at various points, and it's a humour that I didn't really like. It's almost like it's breaking the fourth wall, but instead of talking to you as the reader, it's talking to the entity that is chronicling the story, and that entity is giving little updates as well, saying things like, I thought we weren't going to do that, or I thought you were just recording this for yourself, why are you talking about dear reader, and things along those lines. And it didn't work for me. I didn't get on with it at all. But the other reason that I DNF'd this one, we did get into the story a little bit better. I DNF'd this at just after 20%, and it was 30% for the Warden. So we were getting into the main kind of feel of the story a little bit quicker in this one, but I just thought there were a few little issues for me and my particular reading tastes that I was having with this one. One of those is that the main character, Kyla Stern, with this entity that he's got, the Kakari, is just too overpowered, and it means that there's no real intensity, there's no real kind of feeling of will he or won't he get out of this situation, because he just is a bit like Superman, essentially. It just seems like he can do anything, he can heal himself quicker. And I've had this a couple of times. The Crew by Sadir S. Samir was another one recently that I DNF'd, and one of the reasons was kind of the same. The main character was just too overpowered, he could do everything, he was better than everyone. And that's kind of a little bit boring for me, if I'm being honest. Now, with this one, the humour and the writing, as I say, was the other reason. And one of my criticisms of the Lightbringer series by the author was his fixation on breasts, and it was really prevalent and it came up quite a few times. It's one of those things that when you start noticing it, it's impossible to miss it. With this one, it seems like he's moved on a little bit, but he literally, in the words that he wrote, literally said that he was going out of his way to avoid talking about somebody's breasts. But of course, by doing that, you're still drawing the attention to them. So it was a little bit weird. It was like, I've moved on and I'm not going to do this, but actually I am still doing it. So that one, it just didn't work for me. It was kind of a childish humour, I thought, with those kind of scenes. And overall, I just decided one day when I was reading it, do you know what? This isn't getting any better for me, so I'm just going to put it down and pick up something else. Okay, so on to the actual books that I did finish then, and I'm going to start with one of my SPF BO8 finalists. This one was by Quenby Olsen, and it's Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons. So this is one of the several finalists actually in this year's competition that aren't for me, and therefore, spoiler alert, there's no rating for this because it would be unfair of me to provide a rating, especially on the retail sites and on Goodreads, because I'm not the target audience for it, so it wouldn't be a reflective rating of the book. So this one I didn't really enjoy, but I wasn't expecting to because I'm not the target audience. So you've got to take anything I say about this one and the other two that I'll mention today with a pinch of salt, I suppose, because if I was to enjoy the book, it would have been a pleasant surprise, but I'm going into them knowing that chances are I won't get on with it. With this one, the setting wasn't really for me. It's set in the UK, it's set in our world, which is one of the things that I don't like. I like escaping in my fantasy, I like a secondary world. And this one was kind of a Regency, I think it was Georgian England. And we've got a character who's a spinster essentially, and she inherits a dragon egg as the catalyst to this story. Now, the story itself just didn't work for me because I don't really have an interest in this type of setting and the type of story. Some might call it the cozy fantasy that we're seeing a lot of. I have read a couple of cozy fantasies that have worked for me because they kept my interest through the writing and through the events that did happen. This one didn't do that for me. And part of the writing that really kind of threw me, really stopped me getting into the story, was the massive overuse, in my opinion, of parentheses. There were brackets all through the book. When I was talking about this book on my Discord as I finished it and provided updates, I did count them using the search function on my Kindle app. And I can't remember what they were, but it was something like 500 pairs of brackets. Although I say pairs, it was actually mismatched. There were a few opening brackets that didn't seem to get closed. So that kind of threw me, because that's my proofreader brain thinking, where are those closing brackets and why weren't they closed? And it just, overall, it was just too many. It was something like 3 or 4 per page, it seemed, and certainly at some points it was. And you had nested parentheses as well, so brackets within brackets, and whole paragraphs enclosed in brackets. And it became almost a bit of an obsession, as you can probably already tell, because every single paragraph pretty much I was reading had an aside, essentially a bracket, and it really threw me out of the story because I was changing tone and changing pace as I was reading it to go along with those. So this one was one of the ones that I wasn't expecting to be a favourite, and unfortunately it did live up to that, or live down to, I guess, that expectation, and it wasn't one for me. So as well as 3 SPF BO8 finalists that I read in March, I also read 3 arcs from Netgalley. This third one that I'll talk about now is one that I actually did finish, and it's one that I did quite enjoy, and it was Antimatter Blues by Edward Ashton. This is book 2 in the Mickey 7 series, the first book of which is going to be a feature film next year, I think it is, starring Robert Pattinson under the title Mickey 17 rather than Mickey 7. With this one, we follow on, I think it's a 2-year gap in between the end of Mickey 7 and Antimatter Blues, and we follow similar kind of adventures essentially, minus the kind of doppelganger, I guess, kind of storyline that you have in Mickey 7. I'm not going to spoil Mickey 7, but that part is within the synopsis of the book. So with this one, the way Mickey 7 ends, there are certain things that you can't really have in the second book, so we have to deal with new things to continue a storyline essentially. But I like how it did kind of wrap up, and it went back to the events of the first book and used those essentially as the catalyst. So we're still dealing with Mickey and his friends, they're still on this planet, we've still got the bugs that are out there as well, the creepers, and we're having kind of tenuous conversations with those tenuous alliances, I suppose, with these creatures that are on this planet that they've landed on. And the story allows us to see more of the world and more of the creatures and get closer to them and see the different societies that they have. And I quite enjoyed this one. I thought that it was quite inventive the way that it continued the story whilst somehow moving aside from the expendable human of Mickey 7. So I definitely appreciated that. It was one of the better books that I read in March. I definitely had a good time with it. I love the cover, the UK cover at least, of this version as well, so I'm looking forward to getting a paperback to match my copy of Mickey 7 that I've got in a similar design but different colours. Overall, I had a great time with it. Definitely recommend it, especially if you have read and enjoyed Mickey 7, and I gave this one 4 stars. Then I moved on to Deathless Beast, which is book 1 in the Collation series by Andrew D. Meredith. I was gifted by the author a review copy on audio of this one, and he narrates it himself, which I do appreciate. I've said before that I quite like when the author narrates his own work or her own work, because you get all the different nuances that the author actually intended. They know what they're talking about, they know all the pronunciations and the inflections to use and things like that. With this one, we've got a really expansive world. It's really well detailed. I A lot of people have spoken about this one in their reviews and kind of linked it into Tolkien with the world building. I'm not one to do that, but I can see why they would make those links and say that it is similar to Tolkien's world building. I wouldn't go that far, but I can definitely, as I say, see where they're coming from at least. The story itself just didn't really work for me in this one. I felt that it was more about the world than about the characters or the actual plot. And although I appreciate that, I do want more plot or more characters or both, rather than a focus on the world building. So it did fall down a little bit for me in that respect. I found sometimes that I wasn't drifting off, but I wasn't necessarily taking everything in it. And a couple of times I had to go back and listen to a bit again because I thought that I'd missed something. And it was just because I think for me, the story was just a little bit too slow going and not enough happened, or certainly not enough in a quick enough sort of time period for me. So it was a bit of a letdown in that sense. Although I would say that I appreciated and I liked the author's narration, I think actually for this type of story, his narration was a little bit too soothing. It was definitely one that I could get on with. It wasn't one that was sending me to sleep or anything along those lines. I'm not saying that. But I think that definitely helped me, or hindered me, if you like, to lose track a little bit sometimes, because I was listening to his voice but not actually listening to the words sometimes, because it was just too soothing, and it was a little bit for an audiobook narration. I think for me it was just a little bit too easy listening. So I didn't have as good a time with this one as I'd hoped. I loved the world, I loved some of the creatures that we had, but ultimately I was, again, when I was talking about this on my Discord server when I'd finished it, I was saying that by the time I come to look back on the book, even at the end of the month, because I read it towards the start of the month, I didn't feel like I would retain a lot. I didn't feel like it was one that was going to really stick with me for a long period of time. So this is one that I decided not to continue with. I'm not going to go for book 2 in the series, because although I had an okay time with this one, I didn't feel it was one where the story really gripped me and I was really invested in either the story or the characters enough to move on with. So this one I did give 3 stars to. I did enjoy it, but I wanted more from it. So from Deathless Beast, I went to Mysterious Ways by Abby Evans. This is another one of the SBFBO 8 finalists, and I actually, rather than from Deathless Beasts, I went to this one after I DNF'd. I think it was The Warden. So I went from a book that I didn't enjoy enough to actually put down without finishing, to a book that, again, was one that I was expecting not to be enjoying. So not the best of plans, but never mind. It was a book that I had committed to read and I wanted to read in that particular month. Now, this one was one of the finalists that could have gone either way for me. It could have worked for me because it's set on a secondary world and it's got some more usual kind of fantasy elements to it. But it turned out actually that those fantasy elements were too much geared towards the angels and demons side of things, and I didn't appreciate that. It's not one that I generally tend to read too much, but in this story it just didn't work for me. Now, one of the things what I did like about this, we've got, as I say, a fantasy setting. We've got kind of investigators. It's kind of a city guard scenario, essentially. And you've got a series of killings and an investigator who is trying to get to the bottom of them. Essentially, the guilty party, when they're found guilty, they're charged, whatever, they are sent to the underworld. And she, the main character, the investigator, is finding that the wrong person is sometimes being sentenced and sent down, so to speak, for these crimes. So she's trying to just make sure that the right person is charged for the right crime, essentially. And she's finding corruption in the force because there are certain factors at play that are pushing this to happen, rather than pushing the right thing, so to speak, to happen, which is what she's trying to work for. So we follow her as she goes through her investigation and she's trying to do the right thing. She's trying to uncover and get around this corruption. But as I say, it was the whole angels and demons thing that didn't work for me. It was a bit kind of twisted. It wasn't just your typical run-of-the-mill angels and demons. We had demon bars, which are these kind of rough places where you go and you got all these sort of nefarious deals going on, and then you've got angel bars, but they're not these goody two-shoes places. They are kind of pleasure palaces, essentially, where you can go and experience pleasures of the flesh, so not your usual kind of angel activity. The demons themselves, probably one thing that really put me off this, and I can blame my 8-year-old daughter actually for this. The first demon that we're really introduced to, the way that he speaks, the things he says, the kind of mannerisms that come across, I ended up reading them in the voice of Discord from My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. And from that point on, all of the demons in my head when I was reading them, they were Discord basically from My Little Pony, and it was kind of a weird situation. The way that they spoke really lent itself to that, I think, which is obviously why I thought it, but once it was there, I couldn't shake that image, I couldn't shake that voice in my head as I was reading them. So that was maybe a little bit off-putting, but never mind. Overall, the story itself didn't really work for me. There wasn't enough there. The world I didn't think was actually too different. If you take away the angels and demons, take away the fact that it is a secondary world, it could perhaps have been set in our world. There wasn't enough of the fantastical in the world building side of things. So again, it wasn't one of my favourites of the month. It's kind of, I guess, middle of the road in terms of the 10 that I've read, or I haven't read them all yet, but in the 10 finalists for me. But it's probably more towards the bottom end of that scale rather than the top end. So next up was another audio. This is my buddy read. I'm going through The Expanse by James S.A. Corey with my friend Nina, and last month in March we read book 3, which is Abaddon's Gate. This one I'm not going to say too much about because I'll be honest with you, I've already started book 4 and they're slightly merging together a little bit, but because this is a 9-book series, I don't think too much needs to be said about the individual volumes within them. I'm enjoying my read through or my listen through of them. I loved the Expanse TV show. I'm still getting that kind of reread element where I know what's going to happen at various points. I'm reading or listening to scenes that I've already seen, so I've got the imagery in my head, I've got the character faces. Still somehow, despite it being audio, I've got the character voices there as well, which is pretty good. I was slightly, I guess, disappointed with this one because some of my favourite characters weren't there. Amos kind of took a bit of a back seat, but he was there. But we didn't have Avasarala, we didn't have Bobby, so that was a little bit of a shame for me because those were highlights, especially Avasarala's humour. Those were highlights of book 2 for me. So this one was still a good read. I think it was, I gave it 4 stars, but I think it was just a bit less than that. It was more than a 3.5 star, but it was just less, I think, than a 4 star for me. But I'm really enjoying the series overall, and I'm looking forward to continuing. As I say, I've already started book 4 and having a good time with that one as well. Then finally we get to one that I've got a physical copy of, although I actually did the audio of this one again as a buddy read with Nina. This was The Mortal Blade by Christopher Mitchell, which is a book that I picked out of my TBR jar last month to read, and we both had a pretty good time with this. There's some really interesting world building on here. It's quite an expansive world because you've got quite a lot going on. I think this is a 16-book series. It's not quite finished, if I'm not mistaken. The last book, or maybe the last 2 books, are shortly to be released, but it's quite an expansive world to fill those 16 books essentially of the series, and you can tell that there's quite a lot going on here, I think, because of the characters that you've got in them. There's quite a large cast, but also you have an opening chapter which I really enjoyed, really showed me some good magic and some good imagery, and then you don't get back to that character until maybe 5 chapters in, so you've got all these other characters and scenarios that are being introduced in the meantime. I liked the kind of living gods that you've got here and the different powers that they have, and then the mortal aspect of it, as per the title, kind of introducing some of those powers as well. I thought it was really interesting, gave some really intriguing storytelling, and it gave some really good characters for me within that. The narration was pretty cool. I liked a lot of the voices that were used here. It was really easy to listen to, so overall had a really good time with this. I am looking forward to continuing the series, but I don't know when I'm going to do so. As I say, it is a 16-book series, I believe, when it's going to be finished, so there's quite a lot to get my teeth into, but they do come in arcs of 3 or 4 books from what I understand. So what I'll probably do is aim to read the opening arc, the first 3 or however many books it is in that first arc, and then we'll see where we go from there. But this one I gave 4 stars to, had a really good time with it, definitely pleased that I picked it up, and this was my favourite first chapter from the SPFBO 7 finalists, so I'm glad that I finally got around to reading the rest of the book, and it didn't really disappoint. And then I went from there to the third and final SPFBO 8 finalist that I read for March. This one was just at the end of the month. I finished a book and I had a few days. It was actually because I put down Ninth Angel Nemesis, so I had a few days left in the end of the month and decided to start one of my April reads early, and this one was A Song for the Void by Andrew C. Piazza. So this is the SPFBO 8 finalist that I was dreading reading the most because it's just not fantasy, essentially. I don't read outside of fantasy unless it's sci-fi. This one is listed as historical horror. I don't read historical fiction. I don't read horror. I don't read historical horror. And that's not going to change. I didn't have as bad a time with this book, thankfully, as I thought I was going to. But I'm not going to go back and look for more within the genre because it just doesn't interest me. The book itself I thought was okay. The story, the characters, even the setting was okay. The upside was I could read it, and that's better than some of the other finalists this year where the writing just really didn't work for me and made it difficult for me to keep turning the pages and get to the end of it. So the writing for this one was a definite plus point. The horror aspects of it I was fine with. I've seen some people in reviews say that the kind of body horror was really, really bad, and it made it really difficult for them to get through the book. There was a bit of a turn towards the end of the book, and that really changed the tone, and people didn't like the ending. I didn't find that. I didn't find that it was something that really threw me out of the story or anything along those lines. But overall, the story is just not for me. The setting, the genre, essentially, is not for me. I went into this book wondering why it was in a fantasy competition in the first place, let alone a finalist. And I guess I'm a little bit sore about it, if I'm honest, because picking the non-fantasy book as a finalist in the fantasy competition essentially says that that non-fantasy book is better than the 29 other fantasy books that were entered into the competition that that particular judging panel had. So I'm a little bit kind of sore about it. I guess it doesn't really fit the competition for me, and now that I've read it, I can't see it fitting the competition. I can't see why it was there. Even if it's a good book, surely the non-fantasy aspect would have disqualified it from the competition or from progressing in the competition. But the judges make up their own rules. But, you know, that is one of the rules. There are very few restrictions. It's down to the judges to judge how they want. So that's fine. It just isn't one that works for me. I did say in my review as well that the only kind of possible fantasy aspects that I could think of here were the horror side of things, the horror aspects, and if you're going to call it fantasy because of those, then you might as well just wipe out half of the horror genre because it's got the same things and just call those fantasy instead. So it wasn't a great experience for me because it's not something that I wanted to read. It's not something that I want to read from, again, this genre. It was a little bit sour because I wasn't reading a fantasy when I was reading for a fantasy competition. But as I said, overall, I did have a better time with it than I thought I would because for the most part the writing was okay. There were a couple of clunky bits in here. I did pick out a couple which really didn't work for me, something along the lines of I stood outside her door and stood guard, and people who've dedicated their lives to working with dedication, and it just didn't work for me with that repetition. It sounded really odd, but actually the rest of the writing, if you take those literally 2 examples aside, the rest of the writing was absolutely fine. So it's probably got 2, maybe 3 other books from SPFP08 from the final below it that I enjoyed less than this one. But unfortunately, that's not really saying a lot. That's more saying things about those books than it is saying about A Song for the Void. So as with the rest of the SPFP08 finalists, or at least the ones that I wouldn't pick up off my own back because they're not my thing, because I'm not the target audience, it wouldn't be fair for me to give a star rating. So here, as on my Goodreads review, I'm not going to provide that rating. So there we go, that's my March reading, and a bit of a ramble there at the end. I do apologise for that, but that's my March reading done. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of these books, if you've read any of them, and of course, how did your March reading go? What was the best book you read last month? I'm going to hopefully see you in the next video sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.